Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Barry Merrick. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the learning chair at YPO Metro New York. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to Laszlo Bock. Laszlo, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you here. Just to provide a little bit of context for everybody joining us, we're going to be having a truly powerful and transformative conversation today on how we can all best unlock our leadership potential and also help unlock the potential of all those around us, both at work and in life in general. So Laszlo is an incredible guest to help lead us through this topic. And in addition to our matching great styles here, Laszlo also brings a tremendous degree of experience. The last time I got to do this with Laszlo, he was still at Google. And during his tenure there, Google had been named best company to work for more than 30 times around the world and received more than 100 awards as an employer of choice. His book, Work Rules, also became a bestseller across New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Forbes, and has inspired millions of people. I've never met anyone working in people ops or HR who don't get very excited whenever I mention Laszlo. So that was his context when we last did an interview like this. Today, Laszlo is running an incredible company that he himself started. It's called Humu, and it nudges our colleagues towards better habits to help unlock their potential and the potential of the whole organization. So Laszlo and I have a lot in common. We're both very passionate about this topic and about the importance of leadership and how far it can make a difference in enabling everybody to elevate their lives and have a bigger positive impact. So Laszlo, once again, thank you so much for being here. I want to kick off by asking you, of all the organizations you've seen, including Google, including Humu, but all the other ones that you've interacted with, what have you seen to be the most critical ingredients of a truly great organization as opposed to just a mediocre one?
Well, as a leader or somebody climbing up the org chart, there's a fundamental choice you have to make up front because, and it has to do with what the definition of a great organization is. There's really two paths. One is, if you define great as a company that makes a ton of money, there's a lot of things you can do. Foxconn is a company that makes a lot of money, but they don't treat their people that well. Many of the folks on the VC will remember they had a problem a few years ago with employees committing suicide because the working conditions were so bad. And their solution was not, and what would happen is they had 4-story factories and people would climb to the roof and throw themselves off. Their solution was not to change the working conditions. Their solution was to install nets between the first and second floor to catch people as they were falling off the roofs of the building. And a lot of large companies subcontract to Foxconn, and that's one way to make money. But I think that's the wrong definition of greatness. I think great organizations are ones that truly embody their values and that actually uplift not just their customers by providing a meaningful, important service, but do something better for the human beings who work there, that make it the kind of place you aspire to work at. So there's a couple big ingredients. One is, as an organization, as a leader, you need to articulate a mission that is meaningful. So my canonical example is, like there's a lot of consumer products companies that say our goals are to be number one in the market. Google historically had been to organize the world's information. Humu's is to make work better for everyone everywhere. A mission like that is really critical because what it does is it gives you something to work towards that you'll never quite achieve because there's always room to improve, but that touches people on a human level. And the reason that's important tactically is you attract better people with a more meaningful mission. You don't get transactional people who are just in it for a buck. You get zealots. You get people who want to follow where you're going. So of all the building blocks in building a great company, the starting point, the foundational one is you have to be about something more than just making a buck.
Excellent. Thank you, Laszlo. As I mentioned to you earlier, we hosted Joe Peterson yesterday, and he also emphasized the importance of mission to ensure people are climbing the same peak and that you attract the right people. So a lot of times employment choices are also self-selecting. So that's a powerful one. What, in addition to a strong mission, a deeply meaningful mission, have you seen to be critical ingredients in terms of how, let's say, a company communicates and conducts itself, and the structures that lead to greatness as opposed to structures that maybe stifle innovation, stifle freedom and expression and so forth?
Well, if you look at organizations generally, and when we started Humu, this actually formed the foundation of our product. The three things that drive high organizational performance are meaning, which we just touched on. And it's not just the institution having a meaningful mission, it's each person personally feeling that their work matters, right? So even if you're in a call center, even if you're packing boxes, whatever the job is. I mean, think about if your job is if you work as, for example, as I did as a waiter. One way to think about that job is you're just trying to get tips. You're just getting through the hours. Another is you're building community. You're creating an environment where people can break bread and get to know one another, and your role in that, whether it's a group of people at your table or whether it's just one person, is to bring them together to bring something to their day. It turns out when people find their work meaningful, on average, they're 21% more productive. The second element is trust. And that runs both ways. It's trust not just in the people around you, but it's trusting leadership and leadership trusting employees. So particularly today, given the economic environment and the pandemic, there's lots of reasons to be nervous about the intentions of companies, which is why you need good leadership and meaningful work and so on. But leaders need to trust that their employees are going to do the right thing. Like today, people are distributed. You can't micromanage, and in fact, it's really bad for performance if you do. So giving people a little more freedom than you're comfortable with is the correct thing to do and builds trust in organizations. The third and important piece is empowerment. So it's not enough to trust the people on your teams. You actually need to give them a little rope. So, you know, one example is when I was in consulting years ago, the first document I produced for a client, the project manager wanted to review it before I sent it. And I went to him and I said, it's ready to go. And he said, do I need to review it? And I said, let me go check one more thing. So I went back, checked one thing, came back, and he said, again, can I send it? Can you take a look at it? And he said, do I need to review it? I'm like, let me take one more look. Third time I came back to him. Third time he said, do I need to review it? I said, no. And he sent it to the customer or the client without actually looking at it. What that taught me was he was trusting me to do my best work, and he didn't want to be a crutch. He didn't want to have to be a second set of eyes. So he was empowering me to do work at my highest quality level. And then he just put it in front of people. I was like 6 months out of an MBA. I didn't know what I was doing. But that local empowerment, plus the trust, plus feeling like you're doing meaningful work, drives loyalty and performance and innovation, all kinds of goodness. So those are the three things as an organization you want to build.
That's excellent. Thank you, Laszlo. Could you share with us, based on everything you just said, what practical policies you've seen implemented at companies that helped companies to make a transformative shift towards really emphasizing these qualities? And ideally, if you could share specific examples that all of us, we've got leaders from around the world listening in on this live, based on those policies, what actions could we take relatively immediately to help move ourselves in the right direction?
So it depends on where you sit in the organization. So the policies tend to be set by leaders. But if you want to think about it, there's an executive layer, a manager layer, and there's lots of manager layers in large organizations. And then there's the individual frontline layer. The actions are different depending where you sit in the organization. And in a way, there's policies and practices. And the more senior you are, the more it's about policies, and your practices carry more weight. So examples of policies that drive you in this direction are, for example, how you think about your goal setting system in the company. If you want to have innovation, you can't have people hitting their goals 100% of the time, because part of innovation is failure. So, you know, one of the things we did at Google that we continue to do at Humu is when we set goals, we sort of assume they're going to be about 60 to 70% achieved. And that's the right balance between setting them too low, meaning 100% achievement, and setting them too high, meaning 50 or 40% achievement. So as a policy, having that in place matters. Another policy that can drive towards trust and empowerment is making a distinction between hierarchy in terms of how you make decisions and hierarchy in terms of how you treat one another. So hierarchy in terms of how you treat one another, we're all created equal. Everyone should be treated in a thoughtful, compassionate, kind way. Decisions need a clear hierarchy because you can't have 50,000 people all saying, well, I have access to the brakes. That doesn't work. So as a policy, you can have a principle that says, I want to push decisions as far down in the organization. And the policy you would have is, I as a leader am only going to escalate to the layer above me if I am less than 90% confident that my boss would make the same decision. Otherwise, all the decisions get made at the first level or second level of management. If I think there's a 10% chance my boss would disagree, I'm going to escalate it just to make sure the person's looped in, just to get sign off. And then as you build trust in the organization, you can change that from a 10% threshold to a 30% threshold or 50% as people have more autonomy, because that's where you get the really cool things happening. So those are a couple of examples.
Yeah, that's actually really great, practical. I love how you put it in percentages. So essentially, from a top-down perspective, if you're setting goals and you want to have innovation, then 60 to 70% is a target of success versus failure. And then in terms of escalating a decision up, it's if there's a greater than 10% chance that your superior might disagree, that's when you escalate it. Great rules of thumb there. Thank you, Laszlo. And in terms of let's really focus a little bit more on the individual leader. We talked a lot about organizational policies and as groups of individuals and hierarchies. Let's really focus on an individual leader. For an individual leader in a leadership position, however they got there, the ones that you've seen be most effective, right? How do they conduct themselves? How do they treat their day and treat the people that they're working with that enables them to distinguish themselves? And what are the key, again, ingredients that enable them to do that we can learn from?
There's a few things that individual leaders do that make them really, really successful, and that inspire loyalty and high performance. One is consistency. So as a leader, you're under a lot of pressure. And that pressure can get to you, and you can be snippy, you can get upset, you can make rash decisions, you can flip-flop. That's really hard for teams to deal with, because the ideal leader is somebody where you look at them and, like I was saying before, most of the time kind of what direction they would go in. Without that, there's a whole layer of stress and anxiety and paranoia about, oh, what's this person going to say? What's that person? Are they going to be in a good mood? Are they going to be in a bad mood? How's this meeting going to go? So number one is you want to be consistent. Again, at the 90% level, right? We're human beings, you get new information. Number two is, and ways you do that, by the way, are not just making the same decision again and again, but being careful to explain your rationale for decisions. So if someone comes to you and says, should we go left or should we go right? Should we build this factory? Should we not build this factory? It's not sufficient to say, don't do it. You have to explain why, because that allows people around you to figure out how and why you think. This is something that at Google, actually, we were not good at for a long time, because Larry and Sergey were pretty opaque in how they made decisions, and they often disagreed. So what ended up evolving was this guy, Jonathan Rosenberg, who ran product for 9 years, amazing, wonderful guy. He became the interpreter for the Oracle. He had to be the one saying, oh, well, what Larry means is the following. When he raises eyebrows and shrugs, that doesn't mean go ahead. That means he thinks it's a terrible idea. That need for an interpreter for the Oracle is a failure to be consistent and clear about how you make decisions. The second is authenticity. People really value getting to know you as a human being. It doesn't mean you have to have, share every personal secret, but, if you're nervous about something, you tell people, I too am nervous about this, and then explain the meta game, right? I'm nervous, but here's why I'm not freaked out, right? Global pandemic, I think we're all nervous. If you as a leader show up and don't say anything about that, people will question whether they can believe you on other topics. And then I think the third thing that great leaders do is it goes back to the mission thing. They make it about something bigger, and they set something to drive towards, to bring people together. And there's dynamics that then drive team performance within this, but as a leader, those are the things. People want consistency. They want to know you're authentic, they can trust you, and they want to know they're going in the right direction. The beautiful thing is if you do those things correctly, you actually need to do a lot less of the other things that are management, not leadership. You don't need to micromanage as much. You don't need to check in as much. You don't need to. So by doing these kind of higher level leadership behaviors, you actually free up a lot of capacity for yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laszlo. So for many of us, hearing everything that you're saying, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's reflecting on how much of a work in progress I am and my organization is. And obviously, very few organizational leaders would say, no, we have the perfect culture and we have the perfect way of working together. As you were giving examples right now from Google and all the improvements you had to make, I believe that's like a pretty common thing across the board. So given that most of us want to do a lot better, no matter where we are on all these topics that you're talking about, what would you say is kind of the best way for an organizational leader who at the moment, especially now that there's a pandemic, there's a lot of forced change happening, for those of us that really want to take things to the next level with our teams, with our leadership styles, what are the key things you think we can do right away? Is it a question of like taking this as a hard reset and start changing things fundamentally? Or are there also like little things that you say, hey, like just starting tomorrow, just do these things and it will already start nudging you in the right direction? What would you say?
It's definitely a little bit of both. But the bigger changes come from the small actions. So it turns out human behavior is really, really hard to change. And most human beings actually have two operating styles. They have how they normally operate, happy-go-lucky, life is good, I'm an inclusive leader and things are fine and I'm optimistic and my glass is half full and, we'll get through this. And then there's a second way human beings operate, which is when they're under stress. And people broadly fall into a couple of categories. There's people who become much more autocratic in command and control. We got to do this, we got to move, we got to get done. And there's a large portion of the population that become more subservient, that actually seek out autocracy, that seek out dominating leadership. And the reason they seek that out is out of fear. When things are bad, they look around and say, oh my God, where's a source of comfort? Where's somebody who can just tell me what to do? And that's incredibly dangerous. I mean, that's how you get World War II, right? It's an incredibly dangerous thing. So building on the kind of conversation we've been having, in an era like today, as a business person, you absolutely should take a hard look at your business and your teams, and you should make hard decisions. And my bias is you should cut an inch deeper than you think you need to. And you should do it quickly, and you should do it humanely. So every time in my life I've had to do staff reductions, and I even had to do that at Google, I make sure that the benefits we provide are above and beyond what other people normally would, or above and beyond what is like fiscally prudent. Because the secret is, if you're a publicly held company, if you have a one-time hit to earnings, the market doesn't actually care. It's just your CFO gets freaked out about it because they care about every single quarter and all this. The market doesn't care about one-time things. So do the right thing for your people, right? And an incremental little extra bit of salary, it's not going to break the bank even if you're a startup. So you treat people humanely, but cut a little deeper than you need to. And then in terms of how you actually interact with your teams and go forward, there's a million small things. And, I'm partial to the phrase nudges. There's a chapter on it in the book. Cass Sunstein, who coined the phrase, is a good friend, and our company's premised on it. But it's all the little small actions that add up to change. And the reason for that is if you say, I'm going to run the New York or Boston or San Francisco marathon, you don't go out and run 26 miles on your first run. And in fact, if you want to make sure you run it, you don't do it alone either. You sign up with a group of friends, you have social commitment. That social commitment and social pressure is a nudge. It's a reinforcement of a behavior that you already want. So if you want to navigate this stuff as a leader with your teams, there's a whole bunch of small things. And we can spend an hour on just these, but I'll give you some examples. One is you should dedicate the start of many of your meetings to just checking in with people. Like, again, everyone's in mode 2, they're panicked, they're freaking out, everyone's trying to drive results, maybe we're worried about our own jobs. You can drive through every single meeting, but people are going to be exhausted. And what people are now starting to talk about is this kind of Zoom fatigue, pandemic fatigue, this mounting cost of how exhausting it is to be always on, always in this format. So start every meeting by checking in. One of the things we used to do at Humu for a long time was we would ask everybody to report on their own misery index. And we would say, on a scale of 1 to 100, how miserable are you? And we didn't believe anybody if they said 0. There's always something, right? My cat is sick. I have a grocery list in the back of my mind. I got to pick my kid up from daycare. I'm worried about my mom. So on average, we found people to be about 5 to 10% miserable. And if there was a spike, then the whole team would say, okay, question 1 is, how miserable are you? Number 2, how can we help? That's a small nudge that makes it okay to kind of get this out in the open. Another example of a small change you can make in how you conduct yourself these days is to give people an outlet to connect socially. Most of us are exhausted by the end of the day. Like, we've got there's reasons why Zoom is more exhausting than in-person meetings. One of them is, in a normal meeting, you don't actually make eye contact for 8 hours a day. That's really tiring. So schedule purely social sessions or turn the video off. People engage very differently when it's just voice than when it's voice plus video. When it's voice, you can look out the window, you can reflect, you can be more creative. So make sure you schedule some of that social time and change the modality a little bit. And those both actually have a huge impact on how people feel in performance.
Thank you, Laszlo. You've given so many great percentages of how to do different things. So when it comes to this suggestions that you made, you said, let's start every meeting with, a check-in, and let's, you're suggesting for us to schedule the social time or non-work time together. So could you give us a percentage on these, a 1-hour meeting? How long would you spend on the check-ins, and how do you keep it from becoming lame? Like if it's the same thing every time, what have you found to work well? And also the social time, is it like a half an hour a week, an hour a week, more or less? What have you seen work well? Obviously, it all depends on which company, but in your experience.
So it does depend on company, and people habituate to things. So it's sort of, the classic example is the first slice of chocolate cake you have is amazing. The second slice is pretty good. The third one you start, feeling pretty ashamed. And it's related to something called the hedonic treadmill, which we can get into at habituation. But you actually, particularly now, need to change it, and you don't need to do something every single time. So you may start, so in an hour-long meeting, the first time you do it, it'll be very short. So maybe less than 5 minutes. Let's say you got 10 or 12 people, because you go around the circle and people are going to be like, this is weird. And then by the third or fourth time, people will be opening up, particularly if you as the leader start by sharing something personal and making that safe. And when somebody says something, you actually engage on it. And it might take 15 minutes. And then you want to start pulling it back, because it's, the point is not to have a therapy session. The point is to let people kind of clear their minds. And that's when you might say, let's just do the percentage, or, only share if it's a big thing or if you need help. And then you might change the practice. So one of the things Lululemon does, for example, is Lululemon's culture was founded in yoga, right? Like first product was yoga pants. And it's really core to who they are. So they often will start meetings with a small meditation. So they meditate for a few minutes and they declare your intentions for the meeting, and then you're off and running. So you may switch from a check-in to a misery index to a meditation. You may do it you may decide what the right cadence is. So at Humu, we've changed from having, when we were small, we had a daily stand-up for the whole company, 15 minutes. Then we went to once every 3 days. Then we went back to we went back to daily, given everything that's going on. So the important thing is, the principle underneath it is give people some space to be human and kind of clear their agenda. The vehicle for that and the frequency you should manage and change. And when it starts feeling like it's not working, check in with a couple people outside the meeting and say, are we spending too much time? And if they say yes, great. If they say no, grit your teeth and put up with it for a few more sessions before you change it.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. I think this is also a challenge for all of us to reflect on, what makes our organization distinct based on our mission, or what what is the service or product we provide, and then try to integrate that into the kind of team activities. So just in our case, last few times we've been going around sharing what have we learned in the last week, right? Whether it's like a very fun social thing or whether it's some really serious topic that we learned about. So like Lululemon has its yoga, I'm sure every company has something that they can bring to their own. Want to ask you, so just on the nudges, because I know this is what Humu also does. So could you share with us any other nudges that you found to be very powerful, and specifically how Humu approaches this? So if an employer chooses to integrate these nudges to make sure that people are always getting like a little bit better off in their environment and how they feel, how does it all work? And are there 2 or 3 other things that you'd want us to keep in mind?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, but fundamentally the way we think about it is there's 2 starting points: a diagnostic that gets down to every team level and figures out the specific issues and the specific one behavior that team needs to change to drive the most improvement, right? And the most happiness and performance and what have you. And then the nudges will nudge you in those directions. The other approach is we actually start, and with we recently built and launched something around organizational resilience for weathering the pandemic. That actually doesn't start with a diagnostic. It just starts with nudges saying, okay, here's where we are today. And then within the nudges, it auto-adapts to what each person and team needs. Some of it is we ask questions, some of it is picking up ambient signal, but we sort of find that the answer varies quite a bit by team. But everybody is often at the same starting point, and then you sort of discover that through the nudges. So I'll give you 2 quick examples. One's from this. I can't share the company name, but it was in the engineering department, and we sent a nudge to the team. The biggest issue that was holding them back was the psychological notion of gratitude, because it was the IT department. It was a larger deployment, but this was the IT department. And they didn't feel appreciated, because as that team often doesn't, right? Like you only notice the IT department when something breaks, right? When the Zoom doesn't work, when my laptop needs something fixed. So we sent a nudge to this one young woman that said, express gratitude. And the nudge basically said, it's the biggest thing your team can work on. It's going to cause the most good. So next time you see somebody, thank them for something they've done, and bonus points if you do it in front of a manager or a customer. So terrific. We had an email back from this woman, and she says, I got the nudge and I didn't really know what to do with it because I'm an introvert. And I really don't feel comfortable getting in front of somebody, and it just feels like it doesn't feel natural. So what I did instead was I started writing Secret Santa gratitude notes and leaving them on people's desks. And today our director of IT walked around, this was obviously a month ago, spent the whole day walking around the office carrying the card that I gave him with a big smile on his face. And thank you for giving me the idea that gratitude matters and a way to fulfill it. I got another email from somebody at Goldman Sachs who was using the product. The nudge there in that case was around just expressing kindness, right? And that doesn't seem like rocket science. A lot of these don't superficially, but it's rooted in a diagnostic about what is needed there. And literally her email started, I'm not used to seeing the word kindness in an email at Goldman Sachs. And then she went on to explain how she did somebody a favor in the way they wouldn't, and then they passed it on and did it for somebody else, and you had this cascade of positive behavior. So these small interventions and tips are powerful, and then when you pair them, as we do, with not just nudging the individual, but a different nudge to the manager and the executive, which we can talk about, you actually can unlock tremendous change, because the key to changing the environment is not just, I want things to be better, what do I need to do? But for me to be supported by my peers, by my boss, by the people around me, so that it just organically feels like, oh my God, things just got better. And it's because every single person is doing a small thing that collectively makes a big difference.
Thanks so much, Laszlo. And all the insights you're sharing are also serving as a nudge for all of us to move in the right direction as well. So I greatly appreciate it. I want to zoom out a moment and really think about, in your perspective, what were the most critical trends when it came to people operations and getting teams to the next level before the pandemic? So what would you, like when you looked at the world, what were the key trends? And then now that we're all experiencing the pandemic at a global level, which ones of those trends are accelerating, which ones are decelerating, and what do you predict on the other side? I know none of us know exactly what's going to happen, but knowing what you know, if you had to guess, how do you think things will change, especially when it comes to truly great, inspired people operations to really get people to be the best that they can be?
I think there's some trends that have accelerated and some that have been largely shut down. Obviously remote work has accelerated dramatically. I talked to a lot of companies, like Fortune 100 CEOs, CHROs, CFOs, who in the last month have said, I don't know if we need to spend $1 billion on real estate a year. One of the customers Humu has, where we deployed our software, they asked us, by the way, can you take a look at, does work from home matter? Like, is it helpful or not? And what we found was, in the old world, the ideal amount of work from home time was a day and a half per week. And the reason is it's enough time to have heads down time, kind of attend to things, be out of the environment, but not so much that you lose cohesion and connection to the team. And we also know that, what happens typically when people work remotely is they're productive for a period of time, but over years, for most people, that productivity wanes. And in part, that's social connections. In part, it's just you don't think of them in the same way. But I think this move to work from home, work remotely, cut down on travel, we don't need as much real estate. I think that's a real thing that's going to stick. So that's definitely accelerated. Another thing that is not good right now, but I hope is accelerated, is a conversation about things like living wage, job security, the obligations of employers and things like that. There's 20 million new people out of work in the last month. State and local governments, there was an article this morning in the newspaper about, an anticipated 1 million people being laid off in the next few weeks from state and local governments. And then you have the whole gig economy, which has dried up in many ways, right? I mean, there's a few pockets of it where people are still working, but it's not like it was. Uber and Lyft just announced roughly 20% layoffs of their employees each. I think that fragility and the discussion around that will accelerate because more people are going to be impacted by it. There's one thing where we were seeing really nice progress that in talking to a lot of companies feels like it's stopped, and that's the conversation around inclusion in companies. As soon as the economy slowed down, every large company, inclusion team had their budgets cut, teams were reduced, and budgets were cut and teams were reduced everywhere. But it gets back to the two modes of operating. If you want to be a great employer, it's only in times of crisis that your values matter. It's easy to have good values when times are good. When times are tough, if you continue investing in things like inclusion, which, by the way, done correctly, absolutely drives productivity. There's a prerequisite for it, which we can get into, called psychological safety. But when you have that, heterogeneous teams massively outperform homogeneous teams. And companies have really pulled back on that. And I think if you think about the communities they're interacting with, it's just a reaffirmation that we care about you, but when times are tough, we don't care that much. So this is actually the right time to really focus on what your values are and where your dollars and headcounts are. And maybe there's some opportunity to actually continue doing some good in those arenas rather than taking our foot off the gas, which a lot of large organizations are doing.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. I do want to also ask you, because we talked about a lot of organizational stuff and we talked about individual leadership. Tell us your perspective on the evolving role of CEO, the organizational leader. What have been the big trends on this, not just over the last few months, but like over the last few years, and where is that going? And the context for this question, I had the chance to interview the CEO of Goldman Sachs, David Solomon, recently. He is a very different CEO than anyone would ever expect running a company like Goldman Sachs based on just stereotypes. So curious where individual leadership is going at top of organizations, what traits are going to be increasingly more valued, and what traits are no longer going to be tolerated the way they might have been in the past?
It's a good question. And I happen to know David. He's a remarkable guy, really thoughtful, smart, with a huge heart, which, as you say, is not what you would expect at a major investment bank. I think you're seeing the emergence of three models of CEO leadership. One is the kind of Foxconn slash and burn, do whatever it takes. Lime, the scooter company. I mean, they're like in a tough economic situation. So, I won't judge them too harshly. But the way they announced layoffs, according to the press, was there was a video conference. It lasted 2 minutes. People were told, you're gone. Everything was deactivated and the company was gone. So that's a model. And I think that's going to exist for a long time because there's enough people who are desperate enough for work, particularly today, that they'll take any job under any environment. And by the way, that's the correct thing to do in this environment. It's far better to have a job, even if it's a crummy one, than to have no job, because then it's easier to get your next one. The second model is sort of the brilliant iconoclast. So Steve Jobs was an archetype of that, famously treated people poorly. Elon Musk seems to be, or Jack Dorsey, I don't know why all these examples live in tech. Ray Dalio in finance, I guess, is one of these people. They're deemed to be brilliant based on their commercial success. And one of the errors we make psychologically is when any of us experience expertise or success in one field, we as human beings assume we know lots of things. So, Elon Musk talking about sending a submarine to, can't remember, I think it was Thailand or Australia, where some kids were trapped in a cave, and then ending up in litigation because of personal insults he threw at the people who actually did the rescuing, right? Elon Musk saying he's going to build ventilators, and then 1,000 show up, but they're not actually the useful kind, and there's no action. If you're really successful commercially, that's a model. Or if you're brilliant, that's a model. And you can get away with it because investors will tolerate that, and people love that kind of story, right? It appeals as human beings, like, the tortured genius. That's like straight out of Joseph Campbell, right? The third model, and I think David Solomon's actually much closer to this. And actually, I've met Doug McMillan from Walmart as well, and Walmart catches a lot of heat for a lot of practices. But I know for a fact when he's part of this fabric as well, I think. When Walmart, as many companies, got the big federal tax break a couple of years ago, they chose to spend most of that money on improving programs for employees, which is pretty remarkable. And again, you can pick lots of fights with Walmart, just like with Goldman Sachs. But I think there's a model of leadership where people do take a broader stand on issues, where they really try to lead from a values-based perspective. And everyone's in business, so you got to make money if you want to stay in business. And if you want to keep your jobs at these kind of exalted levels. But I think there's a very real third way that is emerging and had been emerging. And I think how people conduct themselves and leaders conduct themselves through this crisis will anoint a lot of leaders as ones to watch and ones to follow, and those folks will attract more followership.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. I believe many of us are aspiring to that third bucket, and it's great to have more examples of those individuals leading such great companies. So we have some amazing audience questions, so I'm going to start diving into them. For everybody who's with us live, if you have a question, please submit it in the next 5 minutes or so, and I'll do my very best to navigate through them. So I'll kick off with Anthony Caputo's question. He asks, if there was one thing you wanted for us to take away that would help us lead through this particular time, what would that be?
Number one most important thing, Anthony, is show compassion first for the people around you. Every single person who's dialed into this is a leader in their organizations. And the number one most important thing people need is somebody to pause and not send an email saying, hey, I'm checking in, because now we're getting those from every big corporation, right? Like, and everyone we're a customer of is saying, hey, checking in. But when you actually meet somebody virtually, to actually look them in the eye and say, like, how can I help? I'm here for you. We had a situation at Humu, like a lot of companies, we have a bunch of parents in the company and a bunch of people who are not parents. And what I started hearing was the parents felt terrible because they're homeschooling, they're dealing with kids in the background in a way that the single people aren't. And single people have it tough too. Like, to be stuck in, a 300 square foot apartment with a roommate for a month is like, that's no picnic. But the parents were feeling bad, not just because they felt like they weren't spending enough time with their kids or attending them, but because they also felt like they told me, we're not as productive as somebody who's not dealing with their kids. and I feel like I'm not carrying my weight. So the compassionate thing to do was at our next daily stand-up, apropos of nothing, I said, by the way, here's how we think about it. Productivity comes and goes. This is a crazy time. You first have to take care of yourself and the people around you. So I know parents aren't feeling as productive. It's okay. Everyone's here because they're meant to be here. We want you here. You're secure. So, and you're all good, motivated people. So if you're a little less productive right now, I promise you, nobody is going to judge you 2 months from now, or nobody's going to impact you in any way. And just do the best you can, which you're doing, and we're here for you. So that compassion makes a huge difference for people. And it's the most important thing we can offer right now.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. Here's another one from Grace Hittner. She asks, why do you follow the principle to be generous but cut more deeply than you should while making workforce reductions? I'm interested in the cut more deeply than you should part. And this is my addition to Grace's question. How much has your answer to that, how much has that advice changed for you being at Google and now running an earlier stage company? Would you have answered that differently when you were at Google, and what drives that answer?
Well, thanks, Barry, and thanks, Grace, for the question. The reason to cut a little deeper than you think is because things could get worse. And it feels terrible as a leader to make cuts. I mean, cry me a river, right? The leader still has a job after making these decisions, right? They're not getting the worst end of this. But if you can give people clarity, this is what we're doing, and these are the triggers that would require further cuts. But until then, we're good, right? That gives them comfort. If they don't know what's going to happen next, if it's rolling every week, every few weeks, there's something, then they suffer and they're nervous all the time. But as a leader, you realize, you don't have a perfect crystal ball, and that's why you cut a little more deeply than you ought to. I'll be honest, we made reductions at Humu at the beginning of this month. And the calculus was, in a doomsday scenario, assume no new customers, no new revenues, a third of everything we're doing goes away. What needs to be true for us as a venture-backed startup to have at least a year or a year and a half of cash? And then it's just math, because you know what the income's going to be in this doomsday world. And then you have to make really, really difficult decisions. And we chose to be more generous than we had to be. Which included not just financial generosity, but doing things like, for example, I personally reached out to the CEO or CHRO of Google, Amazon, Facebook. People from my team reached out to VMware and NetApp and a whole bunch of other companies. And we said, look, we've got this set of people. Can you look at them as a group and make sure every person gets personal attention? And they committed to doing that. So, within 2 days, 3 people had job offers. One person, because we're a startup, one person got a 500% salary increase. So do the math on like any number, it's a big number. But it was the right thing to do. My answer and fortunately, we're not in a doomsday scenario as Humu. Within 2 weeks, we signed 2 huge enterprise deals. We've had 3 since then. So it looks like we're avoiding that. But we also told people, here are the conditions where we'd ever look at this. And we actually said we don't need to, because now we have cushion. So versus Google, the difference is one of scale in terms of generosity. When I was at Google, I pushed for, everyone should get at least 3 to 6 months of severance. We should give them, all kinds of outplacement assistance, things like that. As a startup, you don't have the resources to do that. But we did more than is standard for every single person. And we're still in touch and helping folks. And, thank God, people are landing well.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. We've got an incredible assortment of questions pouring in. So let's do our best together to keep the answers to a minute on these so that we can get through quite a few. There's some really good ones. So here's one from Gunjan Doshi. He asks, what are the top 3 KPIs related to PeopleOrg that you recommend we should measure? How often? Any tools you recommend that make these measurements and reporting easy?
Top 3 things. One should be retention, obviously. What proportion of people are leaving? And it's not correct to think of that as regretted or non-regretted. You want to look at retention by performance level. Because if my assistant leaves, it's going to be regretted for me, but Humu will be fun, right? For example. So number one is retention. Number two, you actually do want to get a sense of how people are feeling. The problem is most of the quote unquote engagement tools out there are kind of garbage. Engagement isn't a valid construct. There's all kinds of problems with it. So the simplest thing, if you're very small as an organization, is just ask people like, how are you doing? And, you know, today I would be asking sort of weekly or monthly and just kind of track what's going, but then you need to do something with it. So never ask for data if you're not going to do anything with it, but you should be asking. Obviously, Humu does something in this space for large companies. The third metric I would pay attention to is actually, even today, what's happening on the recruitment side. So what's the experience of the candidates? And the reason for measuring candidate experience is that's sort of a leakage about what it's actually like to be at your company. If they're having a crummy experience, that's because people are stressed, they're panicked. If they're having a good experience and they love meeting you, even if they get rejected, that means people are feeling good and sending the right signals out.
Excellent. Thank you, Laszlo. Here's the next one. It's from Justin Deputy. He asks, as you grow an organization from small, where you know the names of all your people, to a point where that's not possible, how do you maintain that genuine connection with team members that you rarely see?
The easiest way, if you're comfortable with it, is you got to get personal. So when you rarely see them, you know, there's the like, hey, how are you kind of thing. But take an interest in something they're interested in. Even if it means after you meet somebody, you have to write notes about here's what they said. Because as a leader, you're going to meet lots of people, right? It's not a sin to jog your memory a little bit so that when you meet them again, you can ask about their kids, or you can ask about surfing, or you can ask about art, or whatever it is. But getting deep less frequently builds a stronger relationship. And then make sure you spend 80% of your time listening instead of talking about yourself.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. Here's a couple questions that are related, so I'm going to just read them together. One from Andrea Vitali, who asks, you say we should set objectives that are 60% achievable. How can we make sure that people keep motivated if they constantly don't achieve 100% of the objective? Caroline asks a related question. She asks, how do you think about judging people on process versus outcomes? So somewhat related here, how would you answer these questions?
So the 60% achievable thing works if you kind of step back and take a portfolio approach to the work you're doing. So for some of your work, it just needs to happen. So uptime, customer service quality, things like that. The 60% achievable, 70% achievable is really around what are the big, aggressive, crazy goals you're setting. And then the way to judge it is not just was it achieved, but also how long did it take? Did it slip? Like if you still achieved something, but it took 3 weeks longer than you thought, that's okay, as long as it was a big, audacious thing you were going after. And sorry, the second part of the question quickly.
Yeah, just Caroline had asked, how do you balance between asking people, measuring people on their process versus the actual outcomes?
It depends a lot on the job. But basically, in terms of process, you want to manage the outliers. So the people who are super effective and efficient, that should be rewarded. And the people who have what I call a large blast radius, they cause a lot of damage, they impact a lot of people. You want to look at those too. Eventually, and had we more time, there's actually 5 components of performance you should be looking at. One of which is absolutely volume of output, one is absolutely efficiency, one is absolutely blast radius. But the expedient way to do it and to think about it is for process and efficiency, manage the outliers. And for goal achievement, everybody should be measured based on that.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. Here we have a great question from Katie Mayers, and some might say this is like the holy grail of things. How do you optimize workplace culture to assist employees in finding personal meaning in their work?
So actually, we do a lot of that work, and it's rooted in the work of Yale professor Amy Brzezinski. What Amy found was that across job types, nurses, doctors, lawyers, garbage men, housekeeping staff, only about 1/3 of people find meaning in their work. And there's a whole bunch of different techniques to make that link between work more meaningful. One of the ones that she pioneered is something called job crafting. Job crafting is basically you write your job description and then you write what is meaningful to you. So, you're not a cook, or my waiter example from before, right? You're actually like bringing sustenance and community. Turns out when you do that, people reframe the jobs in their heads and they perform them in a very different way. Another way that Adam Grant from Wharton University pioneered was if you connect people to the end recipients and beneficiaries of their work. So, it's not just you're a call center or a salesperson, but find out who's at the ultimate end of this, who's on the receiving end. There's the Google Maps product, and it's a map, big deal. But then a story bubbled up about a guy who had been, who as a child in India got lost and got adopted by a family in Australia, and then 20 years later found his family by using Google Maps. That is meaningful. You're not just sticking labels on like satellite imagery, you're like actually changing someone's life. So find those stories and tell them again and again, and that will make the job more meaningful.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. I've also heard from a few other people I had a chance to interview that creating a repository of those stories, the success stories, the outcome of the work, is something that should be done on an ongoing basis and could be one of the most powerful way to get a company to focus during a crisis and so forth. So that's a great one. Thank you so much. Laszlo, I want to ask you, before we only have a few minutes left, you have a very particular approach when it comes to managing teams, measuring performance, right? You're very values driven. I want everybody to get a sense of like where this is all coming from for you. So would you be open to sharing maybe one or two experiences, either from growing up, your story from younger days, or something that happened to you during your career that maybe really helped you to crystallize your vision of what leadership should look like, how people should be treating each other at work? Because like you just said in your last answer, when we connect it to deeper story, the broader picture, some of these points that you made might be driven home for us much more effectively too. So if you would love to hear one or two anecdotes that really made you who you are.
Sure. Well, part of it is rooted in having been born in communist Romania. And with my family, my dad snuck us across the border and into Czechoslovakia and then into Austria, and staying in a refugee camp there, which I was too young to remember, and coming to America. And the reason we came to America was, at the time, America stood for, truth, justice, and the American way, and freedom, and respect for one another's, and kind of the shining city on the hill. And, I think we have a chance to once again be that in a way that I don't think we are as much today. But that notion of individual freedom and something bigger than itself, belonging to something bigger than yourself, was absolutely formative and something I just grew up with. And also because I saw how wrong it could be when the government monitors every individual and spies on them and turns neighbor against neighbor. It shows up throughout my career. I have very strong views on privacy. It shows up in our Humu product. It's part of what I loved about Google. But like at Humu, if you use our product and then you don't want to use it, like we don't just like delete your data. We actually rerun all our algorithms, because from a machine learning perspective, if that data stays in there, you can actually back into that individual's data and it's discoverable. So that was part of it, this drive towards freedom and respect for the individual. And then professionally, I just had a ton of awful jobs. One of my first bosses, when he would ask my opinion, the way he would ask is he'd say, hey, Laszlo, you're a fucking kid. What do you think? And that was his way of asking me what I thought, right? And pardon the language. I had other bosses that made me feel like they really cared about me. And I realized that the same job can be a fundamentally different experience depending on how the people around you conduct themselves and the values of the company. And then what I learned at Google was you could actually bring some science, computer science and behavioral science to all this, which then culminated in, why don't we make this available to everyone in the world? Because every one of the 4 billion people who work deserves freedom and purpose and a great experience. Like, we're all going to have bad days, but they don't all need to be bad days. That's where it all comes from.
Thank you so much for sharing those perspectives, Laszlo. It's much appreciated. This has been wonderful. To help us wrap up, I'm going to ask you the final kind of a two-part question. One, you've been incredibly insightful and generous with your thoughts and the calls to action you've given us and the way you've galvanized us. Would love to hear from you a call to action on how all of us here can best support you in your endeavors. What's most critical to you these days? That would be just great for us to hear and keep in mind. And then finally, I'd love to hear your call to action for all of us. So starting tomorrow, if there was one thing that you'd want us to do differently, what would that be?
Well, look, I've been really fortunate, and we're a startup, we're growing, so like the more companies we can help, the better. So we're here for all of you, and that's the closest I can come to asking for something. I think for everybody who's listening or who will watch and listen to this, I think the biggest thing is don't underestimate the power of small steps. One of the things that I've done throughout my whole career is, and this is driven probably more by insecurity than anything else, my commute home, which is much shorter today, has always been spent kind of looking at what did I do that day, what did I do wrong, and how can I get better? And I think that's part of what people who end up performing well do. They're constantly re-examining and trying to get better. So I would ask all of you, think hard at the end of each day. What are the small things? What's one or two different things you might try the next day to make yourself better and the people around you better? And it turns out those one or two small things make a big difference.
Thank you, Laszlo. Absolutely. The small things add up. And to add to everything you said as a call to action, one, I do have it on my bookshelf on a permanent basis. Work Rules is Laszlo's book that came out a couple of years ago. It's pretty much a Bible to everyone in people ops and people who really want to help unlock potential. Has been invaluable for me, so I do highly recommend it. We only got to touch briefly on a lot of very important topics. A lot of it is in here. And in addition to that, we'll be sending information about Humu to everybody who joined today in case that's a fit for you or somebody else that I'd highly recommend it. And as a final word, want to thank everybody for joining us. And most importantly, Laszlo, thank you so much for all the incredible work that you do. We really all greatly appreciate it, and we're excited to keep supporting you.
Thank you. What Ivy does in bringing people together and creating a live, vibrant community. Nobody else in the world does that. Certainly not in the way you do it, and it's such an important thing to keep people connected and human. So it's an honor for me to be here. Thanks for having me, Barry.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. You're the best. Take care. See you again soon. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Take care.